All righty, so 2 weeks ago, before the storm, it was weird to not have church for a week, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was very strange. So I'm not going to ask you a lot of questions because I'm sure what we talked about 2 weeks ago is probably a little far and distant from your mind, but we started this series that I'm calling the Top 10 Epic Fails of the Modern Church. Of course, this is my perspective and my viewpoint, but last time when we started this in the first lesson, we looked at epic fails number 10 and number 9, which were, number 10 is we think we're smarter than the earlier Christians, and modern Christianity tends to put too much of an emphasis on formal seminary type training. Not that that's entirely bad, but for us to think that we're smarter now than the earliest generation Christians and that we know more about the Bible than they do, essentially is to presume that both the apostles and Jesus himself failed in choosing, training, and equipping their successors, right? And bottom line is we're just not smarter than they are. In fact, I think as a group, modern Christianity has far more potential to stray from the truth or to be, have more error in doctrine than ever before because we're so far removed from the source and from the original events, and we have more filters through which we see the historical truth that was given once and for all. And I think I mentioned somewhere along the way in that first lesson that Christians these days, we have to stop seeking that fresh word from the Lord in the form of new doctrines or new prophecies. And this drives me crazy anyways, this whole idea of a fresh word from the Lord, as if the Word of God can ever grow stale or is ever actually outdated. And when it comes to this whole idea of biblical scholarship, we have to remember that Jesus heavily criticized the biblical elite or the scholars of his day. And of course, today we have, in the modern church, we have our own religious elite in the form of seminary professors and seminary graduates. And because our society tends to really revere and highly prize higher education, we tend to place too much emphasis on formal biblical training, as if having a doctorate in divinity or a PhD in theology erases all the conflicts in beliefs and teaching, which we know it certainly does. Because the truth is that we can take any doctrine and we can line up a panel of experts and scholars on both sides of the argument, can't we? We see this all the time. This is one of the reasons why Tim has been able to go out there, say on the internet and even in some cases in person, and debate people who have different opinions about what the Bible teaches on certain key things. And I think we kind of ended with something like how seminary training and having advanced degrees really serves one purpose. Do you guys remember what that was? What's that?
To keep that certain denomination or whatever progressing, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it really is kind of a self-serving process, but it's all about indoctrination, right? And that's where we get the word doctrine. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's really indoctrination into a specific or a predetermined school of thought, right? And all seminaries basically teach from a platform of their own theological bias, right? That's where they're actually coming from, and they require all of their seminarians to toe the party line. And if you don't agree with orthodoxy as they see it, then you don't graduate. You don't get the higher degree. And I also suggested that if somebody submits themselves to one of these higher educational or standardized educational processes, really what they're doing is just learning to parrot or to repeat what they've been taught. And they really haven't honed their own critical thinking skills and never really haven't done the very, very hard work of recognizing your own philosophical bias and your preconceptions. Like, for example, if I was a charismatic Christian who believed in the persistence of speaking in tongues and miraculous gifts or supernatural gifts in the modern church age, I am not likely to go to a seminary that teaches that the gifts of the Spirit ended with the destruction of the temple or within the generation or two after that, and vice versa, right? So seminary students tend to choose their educational foundation in a way that coincides with what they already believe. Does that make sense to you guys? Right? And so it's a self-fulfilling problem. And just because, like I said, just because someone has an advanced degree doesn't insure them against ungodly behavior, which is why we see pastors in churches cheating with their secretaries, and in some of the really big mainstream denominations like Catholicism and Episcopalian or whatever, we see things like pedophilia, and we see homosexuality being fairly commonplace. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that any one individual can't rise above that, right? It doesn't mean that they can't escape this faulty training on their own to seek the truth outside of their educational baggage, but it takes a lot of personal effort. It takes a lot of personal effort, and it takes a willingness to be wrong, which is a difficult thing to do because that goes against our basic fleshly nature of thinking that we're right all the time. Yeah, well,
The other problem is too is that when a person finally achieves their degree and they become a pastor of a church, and that church becomes successful and large, for them to start going against the grain is putting their reputation, their education, and their livelihood in jeopardy.
Yeah, I have a feeling we might see that as another epic fail a little bit down the road. What I'm trying to do is go from the big picture and kind of hone it down all the way to the individual and what we're responsible for, because we as individual Christians make mistakes in our own development, in our own walk, in the own path that we talked about with the whole Narrow Path series. We, in fact, during the Narrow Path series, we talked about a tenacious pursuit of the truth, no matter where it leads us. And the very last thing we ended with in our first lesson was, talking about how discovering the truth is at least in part, the probability of discovering the truth is in part determined by how structured and how disciplined your approach in Bible study is. And so we ended talking about the 8 Berean principles that we use in our personal studies, and that actually undergirds the whole Bereans Bible Institute study method. Now, before we get into the next epic fail, I want to go back to something that I had intended to cover last time. We just didn't have time. I want you to go to 2 Corinthians 10. So I want to show you what Paul says about self-styled religious elites. So 2 Corinthians 10, from chapters 10 to 13, Paul enters into what I consider to be somewhat of an uncharacteristic defense of his position as an apostle. I don't see Paul as somebody who walked around with a big stick, who had a chip on his shoulder, who always had to prove that he was who he said he was. I think he let his knowledge of the Lord, and certainly the working of miracles and the supernatural gifts that he did have, including the ability to put hands on people and bestow supernatural gifts to other people, he let those things speak for himself. But every once in a while, Paul had to blow or toot his own horn, but he did it not because he was trying to gather glory for himself, but because he was trying to correct some things that were being taught or said about him in error. So in chapters 10 to 13 in 2 Corinthians, he does start into this defense of his position. Again, not that he never touches on his authority, but here in these chapters, Paul spends a considerable amount of time addressing his antagonist. In the context of the letters to the Corinthians, there were Jewish Christians who considered themselves to be religious elites, who were sowing seeds of doubt about the validity of his apostleship. And if you read these chapters, you're going to see that he deals with accusations that he couldn't be a true apostle because in person he was unimpressive, right? He didn't use powerful speech, and he was physically, not an imposing figure. He deals in chapter 11 about questions about the purity of his Jewish ancestry. In chapter 12, he deals with accusations that he couldn't be an apostle because he didn't impress anybody with powerful visions and revelations. And also in chapter 11, they accuse him, or he answers the accusation that he couldn't be an apostle because he didn't exercise his authority in a very commanding way. And when you start looking at those accusations, it's really looking at the way the world looks at people who are supposed to be leaders. Like, we tend to think of them in certain ways, like imposing physical presence, powerful speech, and having these special connections to God to reveal knowledge. And, had Paul done all of those things, he would have been seeking his own glory, whereas most of Paul's interactions with the churches that he either established on his own or wrote letters to that others had established, Paul spoke and worked with humility because he wanted God to get the glory and not himself. And so in 2 Corinthians 10:1, let's pick it up there. He says, "Now I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent am bold towards you." And what he's saying is, sometimes I write harsher than I speak to you when I'm actually in person. But he says, "I beg you that when I am present, I may not be bold with that confidence by which I intend to be bold against some." He's talking about how forcefully he's going to deal with his critics, who think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments. And the word here is logismus, which is human logic and speculation. And he says, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is full. And then he hits the nail on the head in verse 7. He says, "Do you look at these things according to outward appearance? If anyone is convinced in himself that he is Christ, let him again consider this in himself, that just as he is in Christ, or is Christ, even so we are Christ's. For even if I should boast somewhat more about our authority, which the Lord gave us for edification and not for your destruction, I shall not be ashamed, lest I seem to terrify you by letters. For his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. Let us consider this, or let such a person consider this, that what we are in word by letters when we are absent, such we will also be indeed when we are present." He's really putting them on notice and saying, the power that you see in my letters, I'm bringing it this time. I usually don't, but this time I am. So let's stop here for a second. I want you to go back and look at verse 4, where Paul says our weapons are not carnal. What does he mean by this? And what are carnal weapons?
Of the world?
Yes, certainly of the world. Give me some examples, like in terms of warfare. Like swords. What's that?
Okay.
Are you talking like angry speech or?
Oh, it could be, yeah, just keep going.
Anything of the flesh.
Anything of the flesh for certain, right? But I think he could be referring and using as kind of a counterpoint and an example. It could be the angry speech and those things, but the things that come to my mind immediately when I read this are things like swords and siege engines, right? Things of the world where you actually wage warfare. Because he uses an example or a phrase here. He talks about tearing down of strongholds, which in a very literal sense would be in a warlike setting, you've got a siege engine and you're throwing big rocks to break down walls. Yes?
Intimidation.
Intimidation, absolutely. And he's being intimidated, or at least this group is trying to intimidate him, or at the very least intimidate the Corinthians into siding with the accusers rather than continuing to accept Paul as the apostle. But where Paul says our weapons are not carnal, he says they are mighty in God. He's not talking about the typical, say, spiritual warfare that I think most Christians would think about, meaning spiritual in the sense of prayer and how that relates to what happens in the heavenly realm. He's talking about spiritual in the sense that we have come to understand the word spirit or breath over the last couple of years, which is something in the sense of something being unseen, but something that has observable effects, right? The whole concept of a breath or a wind is that you can't see it, but when it blows, you can see the treetops moving, so you know the wind is active, right? So when he says that our weapons are not carnal, meaning they're not physical, literal things that you can see or touch or feel, these things are invisible, but they have visible impacts. Really what he's talking about is he's talking about how we train our minds and how we think as Christians. That's what he's talking about. So he says, our weapons are not carnal, but they are mighty in God. And we know that this is the right interpretation because in verse 5, he says that our weapons are for casting down arguments that are based in human logic and reason, and that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. Walter, I know you want to say something there.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say there, because remember Paul argued against the Greek Stoics, the philosophers, and that, you know, showing a contrast here, I think, in my opinion, that when he says casting down arguments, well, what arguments is he casting down of everything that exalts itself? Well, the philosophy of the Greeks was that their Gnosticism, their Gnostic higher knowledge, was that greater than God, and they were thinking, he's showing here that it's not, that it's God's knowledge.
That's right, and he continues to contrast that. Let's work towards that. So again, this word argument in the Greek is logismus, and it in the New King James, it's that root word is actually translated or not translated. The meaning of the root word is the non-emotional thinking or thought process of a philosopher who's seeking knowledge of things that are outside and beyond himself or herself. Right? That's really what this word argument means. It's not necessarily getting into an argument, but it's that philosophical thought process that is completely divorced from knowledge that comes from God. And this word or this term is very commonly used by Plato throughout his writings. And of course, we see it through different Greek philosophers that came out of Platonic traditions. But I don't think it should surprise us that in defending himself against Jewish Christians to an audience of Greek Christians, it shouldn't surprise us that he would use a term that is kind of like heavily laden with Greek philosophical undertones. Right? Does that make sense to you? Because he talks to his audience in very specific ways. Now, these human arguments, as Walter pointed out, as the scripture says, they exalt themselves against the knowledge of God. Like when you start to try to figure out the cosmos and the nature of divinity and all of these different things, but you're coming out of the seat of your own human reason and your ability to understand things absent of a connection with God, then what you're constructing, the stronghold that you're building up, the argument that you were presenting, exalts itself against the knowledge of God himself. Now, in this phrase, the knowledge of God, can be interpreted in two ways. It's, for those of you who are, Greek geeks, like I like to say, it's in the genitive case. It's the knowledge of God, and it can mean knowledge about God. So these arguments are exalting themselves against the knowledge about God himself, or it can mean knowledge that comes from God. And we see the same phraseology or terminology used by John in Revelation 1:1, where he actually opens the book of Revelation by saying the revelation of Jesus Christ. And that can mean one of two things, and it typically means both. It's the revelation about Jesus. The whole book of Revelation is about him. But the book contains revelation from Jesus, because Jesus is speaking in the first couple of chapters, right? The first 3 chapters. And he also speaks again towards the end, at the end of Revelation, as the book closes. But here in 2 Corinthians, Paul is talking about how human logic and reason, separated from the renovated and the transformed mind that can only come when you're connected to God and you're open, it conjures up arguments that steers you away from understanding God's true nature and his character. And it results in knowledge that comes from the world, as Margaret was saying, rather than coming from God himself. That's what Paul is talking about here in 2 Corinthians 10. Now, just for the moment, I want you to jump back to 1 Corinthians 2. Because in 1 Corinthians 2, Paul is comparing the nature of the mind and how it affects our ability to perceive or to receive and understand the knowledge of God. So 1 Corinthians 2, verse 1, he says, "And I, brethren, when I came to you..." Now remember, he's talking to the same church, right? 1 and 2 Corinthians, to the same group of people. He says, "I, brethren, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or wisdom, declaring to you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. And my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in the demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God." This is Paul's humility, right? And elsewhere we see phrases like, "I must decrease so that he may increase." In verse 6 he says, "However, we speak wisdom among those who are mature, not with the wisdom of this age or of the world, nor of the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing. Now here Paul seems to be saying that when you start looking at the things that witness and testify of God, like on one hand he's saying, I didn't come with persuasive words and speech. I let my acts as an apostle and the power of God working through me glorify God, and I let those things speak for himself. But then here he says that we speak wisdom among those who are mature. What does that imply to you guys? Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
Well, I was just going to say that my King James says, "I'm perfect among those that are perfect."
Yeah, the whole concept of maturity or perfection is, or the word perfect, which oftentimes occurs in the King James and sometimes the New King James, just means maturity or completion. That's what it means. But if he says we speak wisdom among those who are mature, does he not imply that he doesn't necessarily speak wisdom to those who are immature? Does that automatically follow from that statement? Well, it's not necessity, but here's what I want to propose to you. It seems to me that Paul is saying that the miracles and the power of God working through him are almost designed to impress kind of like candidates for Christianity, people who were exploring Christianity in his age who weren't Christians yet, but maybe coming into an assembly or a congregation and seeing the miraculous things that were being done by God, because they have no other basis to make a decision. They do not understand God at this point. And I would even argue to the point where Christian novices who don't fully understand the knowledge and the character of God are also probably more impressed by these things that are miraculous, but that mature Christians grow beyond that, and they're not, yes, they are impressed by the power of God. We can never not be impressed by the power of God. But Paul says, I speak wisdom to those who are mature. I speak wisdom and I use words and I use speech, but I do it for people who have a foundation from which they can understand what I say. Does this make sense to you guys? He continues on in verse 7. He says, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages for our glory, which none of the rulers of this age knew. For had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. For it is written, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor have entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for those who love him. But God has revealed them to us through his Spirit, or his breath, his presence. For the Spirit searches all things, yes, the deep things of God. Now, when Paul says, but we speak wisdom of God in a mystery, he's not saying that he intentionally speaks in riddles and cryptic language. He's simply saying that the things that a mature Christian understands automatically because they have a foundation and connection to God, these things are hidden from non-Christians and even immature Christians due to the nature of their minds and their lack of discernment. Yes, Margaret.
And they would misuse.
And they would misuse it. Absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that. Non-Christians have a worldly worldview, don't they? And you can't understand God from that frame of reference. New Christians, novice Christians, immature Christians are stuck somewhere in the middle because they're in the maturing process, but they haven't matured, they haven't experienced that extensive renovation of their mind to the point where their frame of reference has switched from the world to God. And so their frame of reference is mixed with different degrees of influence from the world and from the Lord. He continues on in verse 11. He says, for what man knows the things of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him? Even so, no one knows the things of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received, and what that word is, we have received kind of sounds a little passive, but it actually means to, the word is lambano, the root word is it's to receive to oneself, it's to accept something. He says, now we have received or accepted not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit which is from God. And if your translation says, it should say not the spirit of the world, but the spirit which is from not God, not who, because who implies a person. But the Greek there is neuter, which means object or thing. So if you want to write out or scratch out not the spirit of the world, but the spirit which instead of who. Let me go back and start in verse 12 again. Now we have received or accepted not the spirit of the world, but the spirit which is from God, that we might know the things that have been freely given to us. And yes, this is the Spirit in the sense of the Holy Spirit or Holy Breath, that presence of God within us. But it's more than that. It's what that breath inside, what the presence of God brings to us, which is this internal frame of reference that should determine and influence everything that we see and understand. And it's this very frame of reference that allows the maturing Christian to understand God with more detail and with more clarity, because if you've experienced the same thing that I have in my life, the more that I have matured as a Christian, the more I understand who God is and what He's doing. And I didn't understand. I don't think I could have understood what I know now 10 years ago. I wasn't there. I didn't have that frame of reference. Verse 13, these things we also speak, not in words which man's wisdom teaches, but which the Holy Spirit teaches, comparing spiritual things with spiritual. But the natural man, and that's the worldly man that does not have God's presence inside him or her, but the natural man does not receive, and that really means to reject. The natural man rejects the things of the Spirit of God because they're foolishness to him. Nor can he know them. The influence or the emphasis is on the word can. Nor can he know them because these things are spiritually discerned. The understanding of God comes from the presence of God within us. And in the absence of the presence of God, you cannot understand God. Which is why Paul said in the second book that these arguments, these philosophical constructs that are created absent of a relationship in the presence of God, exalt themselves against the knowledge of God because they're completely divorced from Him. To say it again, the things of God can only be understood from a God-based frame of reference, from that transformed and from that renovated mind that is free from the worldly argument and philosophy. Verse 15, but he who is spiritual, think God-focused. He who is God-focused judges or discerns all things. This word judge is the same word as discern at the end of 14. But he who is God-focused discerns or understands all things, yet he himself is rightly judged by no one. For who has known the mind of the Lord that he may instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. Now, in verse 15, I want you to look at, how many of you guys are reading the New King James? So in your New King James in verse 15, where it says, yet he himself, these words are not capitalized, right? Correct?
The word right is capitalized.
But he and himself are not capitalized? Right, they should be, because it's referring to God. It's not referring to the he who is spiritual, which begins the verse. Let me read it in two different ways. If it refers to he who is spiritual or who is God-focused, it reads like this. But he who is God-focused judges all things, yet he who is God-focused is rightly judged by no one. If you have that interpretation, that's basically saying, nobody can judge or understand the man who is God-focused. But what Paul is saying here, if you capitalize the he himself and you understand that this is referring to God, it says, but he who is God-focused judges all things, yet God himself is rightly judged or understood by no one. Nobody can completely and perfectly and truly know the Lord. It is a constant pursuit. It is constant and it is ongoing, and it will never be complete until he returns. And we know that this is the right interpretation because in verse 16, he says, for who has known the mind of the Lord, that he may instruct him? Do you understand God so well that you can correct God? Absolutely not. Never possible. He says, but we have the mind of Christ. Paul says that we have been given the Spirit of God to transform and renew our minds so that we can understand Him and enter into this constant pursuit. Constant pursuit. Now I want you to go back to 2 Corinthians 10 for me. Now let's go back to that verse 5 where he says, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. He follows with bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. Bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. And again, he's saying that to separate oneself from Christ in the effort to understand Christ is foolishness. You cannot step outside of God and His frame of reference and the influence of His presence in your life, and you can't understand God from that perspective, because if you try to do that, it sets you up as the authority. Which is why Paul said back in 1 Corinthians, who understands God to the point where you can judge God and truly understand and discern His infinite details. Going back to our epic fails, I propose that modern seminary training gives most people a false sense of authority and a false sense of accomplishment. If you've ever been involved in, not that I endorse, like martial arts from certainly, the mystical aspects of that, but I know some of you guys have probably trained in martial arts, or at least know people who have. And there's kind of a saying that once you achieve your black belt, that's the beginning of your education. Most people who don't have a black belt think that the black belt is the end. That's when you become the master. But people who have been through that process realize that once they get the black belt, it just means you've mastered the basics, and there's still more to learn. There's still more growth.
There's 5 more levels.
What's that?
There's 5 more levels above.
Well, depending on the system that you're in, for sure. Right, but going back to this idea that, you graduate from seminary, you got this advanced degree, and you think you have it all, and you're not. You're still a baby. Particularly if all you have learned is to parrot what you've been told in a process of indoctrination. And not only does attaining an advanced degree like that give people, or tend to give people, a false sense of authority and accomplishment, it gives churchgoers a false sense of security and almost a blanket trust of leaders and pastors because they have these seminary credentials. And so, I said a moment ago, the modern church has its own religious elite, which is, the seminaries and all the people with the advanced degrees. And Paul talks about them in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 12. Let's go there, just down the page a little bit. So after Paul is starting to deal with these accusations, he says, "For we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves. But they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. We, however, will not boast beyond measure." I mean, if anybody outside of Christ had the right to boast, wouldn't it have been Paul or the apostles? But he says, we're not going to do that, but we're going to boast within the limits of the sphere which God has appointed us. A sphere which especially includes you. Skip down to verse 17. "But he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. For not he who commends himself is approved, but whom the Lord commends." These Jewish Christians thought so much of their own knowledge and experience that they called Paul's credentials into question. Which is why I love it when he said in verse 11, "The power you see in my words when I write, that's the power I'm bringing when I come in person this time." He was going to settle things once and for all. Paul says that these self-appointed critics commend themselves and measure themselves by themselves rather than comparing where they are with where God wants them to be in the examples that he has set out before him. And it's like a mutual admiration society. Oh, we're all so smart. We're all so smart. Paul calls them unwise.
It's like the discussions, which I know you've seen, I've seen, when you're in a discussion with somebody about something, they'll quote numerous theologians that are all from the same seminary type belief, as if that bolsters their position.
That's right. 100 experts that are wrong are still wrong.
They're still wrong.
And I would agree, and certainly these are general statements, right? And I know that there are exceptions, but I think that there's not much humility in religious academic circles or from the pulpits of many modern churches, especially the mega churches. And I think it's this tendency for man to think he's right in his own mind that leads us to epic fail number 8, which I'm hoping to get through before time is done. And this is epic fail number 10 was we think we're smarter than the original church, the early church. Epic fail number 9 is that we have too much emphasis on advanced degrees in biblical scholarship. Epic fail number 8 is the denominational divide. Now, according to the World Christian Encyclopedia, Christianity exists or consists of 5 or 6 major, fancy word, ecclesiastical cultural blocks. What they're referring to in the statement is how, at the top level, you can break modern Christianity down into a Western tradition, which is really Roman Catholicism. Then you have Protestantism, Anglicanism, you have the Assyrian tradition, you have Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox traditions, and you also have an Oriental Orthodox, which would include things like, Coptic Christianity or Armenian Christianity. And these major blocks are divided into 300 major church traditions, which are composed of over 33,000 distinct denominations. 33,000. Now, where on earth did all these come from?
To think that it used to only be one. That was it.
Yeah.
And that was 33,000.
Now, I said, where on earth did they all come from? And that's exactly where they come from, because they didn't come from God. God gave us one faith and one tradition. There is only one true denomination. And it's the one that Jesus and Paul and Jude spoke about, and it's called Christianity. That's all it is. James and Paul had warned of these ravenous wolves in sheep's clothing that would rise up from within the church leadership to lead people away unto themselves. Paul and the early church fathers routinely fought against the infiltration of paganism and Gnosticism into the church. But not just paganism and the influence from the Greek world, because we had these Judaizers, we had these Jewish Christians that were accusing him of not being an apostle and trying to get people to, become circumcised and follow all of the dietary laws. But from Jesus to John, the expectation of adhering to a single truth prevailed. Paul said in Hebrews 4:3, he says, "Keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, just you are called in one hope, your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all." There is one denomination. And we have absolutely splintered it. Go to 1 John chapter 2 for a second. John is pretty clear that, go to 1 John 2:18. John is pretty clear that the expectation was that you adhere to the one truth, and that if you departed from that, he says that's Antichrist. Now, we tend to use the word Antichrist, and we identify that phrase with the figure, the revelation figure of the Antichrist. But the word Antichrist can apply to anyone who is against Christ. So 1 John 2 verse 18 says, "Little children, it is the last hour, and as you have heard, that Antichrist is coming. Even now many Antichrists have come, by which we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us," meaning they left our tradition. "But they were not of us, for if they had been of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out that they might be made manifest, that none of them were of us." The expectation is clear. Uniformity, consistency, single truth, single tradition. Now, where did all these denominations actually begin? Now, again, according to the stats, and depending on which resource you read, 33,000, 31,000, it doesn't matter. I mean, once you get past 2 or 3, it's a horrible situation. It's just almost unthinkable to think that we have tens of thousands of denominations. Even in the Old Testament and the Judaism of Christ's day, we see different schools of thought centered around major doctrines, right?
Sadducees and Pharisees.
Right, and what was the doctrine that split the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the main one?
It wasn't the resurrection.
It was the resurrection, right? So the Pharisees embraced the resurrection, the Sadducees denied it, and the Essenes shunned both of those groups. In the New Testament, in the book of Acts, we see the story of Simon the sorcerer, right? And he had what we would call a conversion experience. He got baptized. But when he learned that he couldn't buy apostolic authority and power, he left the fold like John described. He went off on his own. After having heard the truth, after having accepted and been baptized, in his infancy, in his lack of a God-based framework, he's like, man, I can buy that. And when he was denied, he left the fold, and his church historical records basically suggest that he became the father of modern Gnosticism. By the early 4th century, debates started to rise about the nature of the Son, the nature of the Father, and their relationship. And I think we mentioned earlier that in 325 AD, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. And out of that, we have the formation, that's where the genesis of the Roman Catholic Church came from. And from that point forward, from the 4th century on, the Catholic Church heaped on piles of man-made doctrines, superimposing them over the apostolic tradition. Ideas like the Pope having ultimate authority, and the idea of a papal succession where today's Pope can be traced all the way back to Peter, and they say that they have ultimate authority over the church and all Christians because they can link back to Peter in a line of succession. And then ideas like purgatory and priests being able to forgive sins and turning bread and wine into the physical and actual body and blood in Christ in terms of communion. Paying to get dead relatives out of purgatory and much more. Only within a few centuries of John having died. In 1050, I'm going to give you guys another real quick history lesson. In 1054 AD, there was a major split called the Great Schism between East and West. And this is where the Eastern Orthodoxy took issue with, among other things, the Pope's claim to universal jurisdiction. They took issue with his claim to supremacy and infallibility, meaning that if the Pope spoke it, it was directly from God. About 500-600 years later, in the 16th century, it was the continued excesses and abuses of the Roman Catholic Church that drove the Protestant Reformation. So men like Martin Luther and John Calvin, another guy most of us probably haven't heard of, named Zwingli. And while the Reformers corrected many of the errors of the Roman Catholic Church, they retained much of what the Catholic Church was doing wrong, almost to the point where some of the Protestant denominations can be considered Catholic light. Walter and I were joking about that before we got started today. And the Protestant Reformation, while it made a lot of corrections, it spawned a whole new era of departing from that one true faith that was given by Christ, handed to the apostles, and then handed to the next generation church. In the 17th century, conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants was so intense that it sparked what was called the 30 Years' War that spanned from 1618 to 1648, and it claimed 8 million lives because they couldn't agree on doctrine. And that added to the 3 million that died in the French religious wars, which were between the Catholics and a group called the Huguenots. And throughout this entire period, there was significant commingling of religious and geopolitical interests and parties, to the point that during that 30-year war that claimed 8 million lives, the French Catholic Church sided with the Protestant reformers purely for politic reasons. So out of the initial divergence of the Roman Catholic Church, we see the original or the earliest fractures of the apostolic tradition, which eventually completely shattered and splintered into the mess that we have today. So what's the practical side of a little history lesson like that? What is a modern Christian to do when faced with so many choices? Think about new Christians who have not inherited the preconceptions of their parents' denomination, because that happens a lot, right? You just grow up in a certain tradition and you continue on. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have, Catholic kids going to, a local Baptist church or charismatic church or whatever. Certainly that does happen. But if you're a new Christian who hasn't inherited your parents' denomination, how do you find the denomination that's right for you?
Put it all down, put all the baggage down and go to the beginning.
Yeah, that's a perfect answer, right? Put all your baggage down and go to the beginning. It really was a trick question for that reason, because what's right for a new Christian is to not buy into denominationalism at all and to shed it, to get rid of it. Stay away from it as far as you can, which when you make choices like that, it immediately puts you at odds with all other denominational Christians who believe that their denomination has better answers than all the other denominations. Or worse, that their denomination is the only true church, which is like what the Catholics believe, that if you're not Catholic, you're not saved. End of story. Why? Because Catholics have been trained to believe that this source of salvation is mediated through the Catholic priest, and the Pope has ultimate authority and jurisdiction over all Christians, all true Christians. Now, as an extension of the denominational divide, which is really the next epic fail, it's really a fumbled attempt to reconcile all the differences of denominationalism, not by returning to the origin and the source, but by what? How about ecumenism? Anybody heard that word before? Basically, and I really don't have too much to say about this epic fail, but this is one of the things that's going on in the modern church right now, is that there is a strategy to ignore the differences among denominations and to focus on the common ground. And that may sound like a great idea on the surface. Why can't we just all get along?
Just love each other.
Let's just love each other and let's just focus on the things we agree on.
Right.
Ultimately what that does is it sacrifices the truth and the obligation to align yourself with the truth for the sake of not causing waves or not being seen as judgmental. Jesus, when he came, actually go to Matthew 10 really quickly. Jesus he said, I didn't come to make peace. Yeah. Matthew 10 verse 34. He says, do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. Now, ultimately, is Christ bringing peace on earth?
Eventually.
Yes, eventually, when he comes back to claim his inheritance. When he was walking the earth in his earthly ministry, before his resurrection and ascension, he says, do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. Now, what's a sword used for? Dividing, cutting, chopping. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemy will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and he who does not take his cross daily and follow me is not worthy of me. When Jesus was doing one of his miracles, somebody came and said, hey, Jesus, your family's outside. What did he say? He said, this is my family. All the people that were gathered around with the anticipation that Jesus was the Messiah, watching him perform miracles, who were following him in obedience. He said, my family is not necessarily my blood. It is those who are obedient to my Father. And part of that obedience is setting aside denominations, not for this ecumenical strategy of let's just get along. I don't want to get along with people who refuse to see the truth. That may sound harsh. I want to work on it, but ultimately if somebody proves to be resistant to the Spirit of God, if they refuse to change their reference point, if they're not God-focused, and if they're not choosing to see the whole world and everything in it and everything that they are and who they are and what they do, if they're not choosing to see that from the frame reference that's given to them by God, I don't want to be part of that. Christ's words and the truth are divisive. And that's intentional, because the core of God's program is ultimately to divide and separate those who secure the right to enter into the kingdom from those who don't. And the church is the steward of that knowledge and is supposed to be preserving it and not diluting it. Now here's a message, not for you guys, because I think we're all on the same page, but for anyone who might be listening online. If you're going to a denominational church, or non-denominational, all right, it doesn't really matter, or even if you're studying in like a home fellowship, you have to recognize that whoever is leading that congregation or that fellowship most likely has a theological bias. They have presuppositions that they don't even know that they have. And it's coloring their ability to see and to teach the truth. Now, let me be really clear. I don't have perfect clarity myself. I'm in my own process. I'm on my own learning curve. And I do not claim perfect knowledge of God. I think three of the greatest questions that anyone can ask a pastor or a leader of any church or fellowship that they're considering joining are these three questions. Number one, can you explain your interpretational paradigm? Can you explain to me the rules that you follow when you study the Bible to make sure that you don't make mistakes? That's question number one. Explain to me how you do it. And if somebody can't explain, you got to get away from them. Second question, when was the last time you changed your position on something that you used to believe, especially something that the rest of the church world, and more specifically your own denomination, believes is sacred and unquestionable? And if the answer is never, you need to get away from it. And then finally, who are you accountable to in your own personal study and preaching, and can they answer my first two questions? Because even, as I lead the local Tampa fellowship, I do it in the context of people who are beyond me, who listen to what I say. And believe me, I've gotten phone calls and emails saying, "Oh, you got that wrong." And you guys have heard me recant from time to time when I've made mistakes. And I will continue to make them, but I will continue to fess up to them. And these are powerful questions in my mind. And I think it should really be the only basis, and certainly the first and the foremost priority in choosing where you fellowship. But that's not how people choose their churches or their pastors. Which leads me to epic fail number 6, which we'll deal with next week, and that is Christian consumerism. Any questions or comments?